If you're struggling to get your mixes to sound as clean or impactful, or basically just as good as you want them to, this video is going to be extremely helpful because I'm going to cover 6 warning signs of a bad mix and how you can fix it. And one thing I've noticed over the past several years of making tutorials and also teaching private lesson students, which by the way you can sign up for on my website if you're interested, is that there are some common mixing mistakes that a lot of beginner producers make, and even intermediate producers who have been producing for several years. And to illustrate what I'm talking about, let's take a look at this Reddit post that I saw a few weeks ago on the FL Studio subreddit. This particular guy has been producing for 13 years and is still struggling with getting his kicks to punch through the mix in the way that he wants them to. And this is actually a pretty common problem that I see a lot, and I even remember dealing with this myself when I first started producing. Now, I responded with this, which is all good advice, and it was tailored more specifically to the tracks that he posted, but I want to do a little bit of a better job breaking this all down. So to start with, I remember having this exact problem when I first started making beats back in the day, and it turns out my biggest problem was actually gain staging, which I didn't even know what it was at the time until another one of my producer friends who was actually going to school for music production told me about it. Now, keep in mind, this was before YouTube was really a thing, so it wasn't as easy to really get your hands on as much good free information as you can now. But either way, understanding gain staging and leveling things properly made a huge difference in getting my drums to punch through the mix the way I wanted them to. And the reason for this has mostly to do with running out of headroom, and in turn, not being able to get the kick or other drums to actually be leveled properly with the rest of the mix. So this is really a leveling problem as much as it is a gain staging problem. But the example that I gave in the Reddit post is that if I'm mixing a track, I'll set my kick at, let's say, -8 dBs, and then the snare will sit a bit quieter typically, and everything else will generally be much quieter in the mix. This will leave plenty of headroom for me to make sure I get all the levels right. Typically, mastering engineers will tell you to leave somewhere between -6 to -3 dBs of headroom, and then ultimately we'll bring the levels back up so your track is nice and loud in the mastering process. Now, the other points I made on this post are also very true. Sample selection is super important and can definitely make a big difference in how good your mix is. Additionally, sidechaining is also another great way to get your drums to punch through the mix better, as it can help free up space for your kick in the sub frequencies. And essentially the concept of sidechain compression is that you're ducking out your sub bass, or honestly any element in the mix you want, to make room for your kick every time the kick hits. Here's a bit of an extreme example just to show you what I'm talking about. So the next warning sign I want to talk about is a cluttered sounding mix. And this can actually happen for a few different reasons. One of the most common ones is just adding too many sounds on top of each other, especially if they start to stack up in the same frequencies. I think we've all heard the phrase less is more, but it took me a really long time to figure out the balance between making sure that I had enough going on that things were interesting and not too much so that things were cluttered. One thing I've talked about a lot on this channel is adding some background textural elements to help things sound more interesting. This can be things like percussion, Foley, and even adding cool effects on various elements in your mix. And in my opinion, this is one of the best ways to make things sound more interesting to the listener while also keeping things simple. However, I've seen producers like Brooks do huge amounts of layering on synths and leads and even basses and still manage to get a really thick and clean sounding mix. But again, keeping an eye on where your frequencies are stacking up and also making sure that everything is leveled properly is key. And this is another point that I want to focus on for just a second. I think that a lot of producers get caught up in the idea that mixing is all about compression and EQ and reverb and various other processes, and forget about the fact that actually the most important part of mixing is making sure that all your levels are balanced properly. And I know that I already kind of touched on this in the last point, but it's super important. Another potential problem that can clutter up your mix is doing too much additive EQ. I think this generally tends to happen a lot more with beginners who don't really know what they're doing yet, but if you do too much boosting, it can result in muddiness or things sounding too harsh depending on the frequencies you're boosting. Personally, I rarely do any additive EQ unless I'm doing it for sound design purposes, and instead I just focus on cutting frequencies that I don't need or that I don't want. And just so you know, muddiness occurs if there's too much low mids in your mix, mix, especially in the areas between 200 to 500 hertz. And honestly, it can be a bit broader than that. And then harshness typically happens in the upper mid-range, anywhere from around 1000 hertz up to around 8000 hertz or so. And a great tool that can help you actually hear and understand these frequencies a little bit better is a platform called soundgym.co. This is a membership website that you can sign up for and use every day for free. And the specific ear training exercise that will help you with this is called Peakmaster. However, they also have a paid tier which has a lot more ear training exercises that you can potentially do unlimited times per day. If you are interested in the paid tier, I have a 20% off coupon code which I'll leave in the description of the video. Now, I just mentioned that beginners are usually the ones who struggle with boosting EQ too much, and this goes for other effects processing as well. If you find yourself adding effects onto random things in your mix, but you don't really know why you're even doing it, then you probably should not be doing it. This is a big warning sign that you should definitely be aware of, especially if you're a beginner and you maybe haven't developed your ear enough to be aware of some of these other points that we're talking about. I was definitely guilty of this, and the area that I did this the most was actually compression. Compression was one of those things that I just didn't really fully understand for a really long time. And so for a while when I first started producing, I would throw a compressor on basically everything. However, I've seen other producers do this with EQ, reverbs, phasers, flangers, basically anything you can think of. And I guess the catch-22 is that you have to experiment with this stuff in the beginning to learn what it does, but you also shouldn't be throwing random effects on everything in your mix, assuming it's going to make it sound better. And so the real solution to this is to really learn and understand what all your effects actually do and how to use them properly. The next warning sign is if things are sounding too distant in your mix. And generally when things start sounding far away or distant, it's a sign that you have too much reverb going on. That's why, as a general rule, if you want something to be up front in the mix, you don't want to overdo it with reverb. I think a good example of this is with vocals. There are instances where reverb can work with the vocal, but I've also heard it make a vocal sound amateur and push it kind of sounding farther back in the mix, and typically it has a lot to do with the processing. One thing to keep an eye on in general when using reverb is to check the high cut and low cut. I would recommend almost always cutting out the low mids on your reverbs, and in most cases cutting out the high end too. It really depends on the sound you're adding the reverb onto and what you're going for, but I would say a general guideline is to cut out everything below 500 hertz and everything above around 4000 hertz. And again, this really depends on a lot of factors, so take these numbers with a grain of salt. The next warning sign is that if your mix doesn't sound good in mono, you might have some phasing issues. The way you can check this in FL Studio is by going to your mixer and then just turning the stereo separation knob on the master channel all the way to 100% merged. This will allow you to listen to your mix in mono. You can also use a correlation meter like the one in Span to check for mono compatibility. This is a free spectrum analyzer plugin that is extremely useful for mixing, and I'll leave a link in the description of the video for a free download if you don't have it. But anyway, the reason why this is so important is that there are certain instances where your mix might be actually played in mono. This can happen in clubs, restaurants, Bluetooth speakers, phones, etc. Now, personally, I love taking advantage of the stereo spectrum and making sure that my mixes sound super wide and that I'm utilizing things like reverbs, delays, and panning to place certain elements in their own space in the mix. But you can do all this and still achieve a really good sounding mix in mono as well. And just as a heads up, one of the ways I like to get a really wide sound is by using stereo enhancing plugins. However, some of these plugins use algorithms which are essentially replicating the Haas effect, which, if you don't know what that is, it's basically taking an audio source, duplicating it, and then panning one hard right and the other one hard left, and then just slightly offsetting them. This particular effect can cause phasing issues, so it's just something to be aware of if you are using these types of plugins. However, plugins like Ozone Imager and the new stock FL Studio plugin Spreader are fully mono compatible. And there is a time and a place for both of these types of plugins. I just wanted you to be aware of the potential pitfalls. Now, the last topic I want to talk about is less of a warning sign and more of just something to be aware of while you're mixing. And it's something that ties into everything we've talked about so far, and it's also something that I've struggled with for a really long time. And that is getting a solid low end in your mixes. There's not really a whole lot of space to work with in the sub area of the frequency spectrum, and because of this, any extra sound buildup can potentially be problematic in your mixes. So one thing I do to help with this is to put a low shelf EQ on instruments or sounds that may have some competing frequencies down in this area. I try to avoid using high pass filters unless I absolutely need to, because they can potentially introduce phasing issues into your mix. But if you can cut out all the other extra frequencies except for the sub bass and the kick drum, then you can use sidechain compression like we talked about earlier to make the low end even tighter. Now I want to get a little bit more advanced and talk about something that really helped me clean up the low end on my mixes, and that is adding some mid-side EQ on my master chain. When it comes to the low end, having extra stereo information down there is actually problematic because it can make things sound messy and also just takes up more unwanted space in your mix. You may have heard to always put your sub bass in mono, and this is the basic premise behind that statement. However, the way that I've started doing this is adding this patcher preset, which is just mid-side EQ. And then on the mid signal, I will just leave the EQ untouched, but on the side signal, I'll do a low shelf all the way up to about 114 Hertz. And then I can adjust this depending on the particular mix I'm working on. This has been a huge help for me in cleaning up the low end and making my mixes sound much more impactful. Now, one thing that I wasn't able to do as much as I wanted to in this video is show you real examples of how I put this stuff into practice. And I do think that seeing this stuff implemented makes a big difference. And a few years ago, I did an extremely detailed video focused specifically on a lot of the aspects covered in this video, as well as a lot of other mixing tips and tricks that I implement into my productions to make things sound more interesting and more professional. Click the video on the screen now to check that out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.